Senator, appreciate you joining me on This Week in Jacksonville. Let me start with the war in Ukraine. There is little doubt it has become a war of attrition. And world leaders say Putin and Russian troops are party to war crimes. With concern rising that he may use chemical weapons or perhaps even worse, is it time for U.S. and NATO allies to go ahead and put virtually everything on the table?
Well, I mean, by everything on the table, you mean an armed conflict? The answer is no. And between NATO and Russia, we should seek to avoid that. Now, obviously, the Russians might do something that triggers it, an attack on a NATO country, for example, or anything that would undermine the security of a NATO country could very well trigger something like that. But I would hope we don't reach that point, not because I don't care a lot about what's happening in Ukraine. I do. I warned about it before it happened. I've been very vocal about it since. But I also think that this is a time for prudence, and a war between NATO and Russia would be devastating for Ukraine and for the world. So we would seek to avoid everything possible. That said, I think we need to do everything we can to help Ukraine win, which I think they have an opportunity to do. I don't think there's any doubt that Putin will not have a strategic victory here. He may very well also have an operational loss, but strategically, there's no way Putin wins, and we need to continue to help Ukraine.
There are people who say we don't know what Putin's endgame is, and there are concerns that he may not stop with Ukraine. Many believe he wants to rebuild the USSR, and the Baltic states are vulnerable by land, vulnerable by sea. Eastern Europe is vulnerable. Does the U.S. need to rethink its military presence in Europe?
Well, unfortunately, because of this invasion, I think there's going to be, for the foreseeable future, a pretty big buildup of NATO capabilities. Of course, NATO is not just America. It's all these other countries, and hopefully it's awakened them to the need to invest more in their own defense capabilities. But I also think that already the conflict in Ukraine going on past 4 weeks has been incredibly debilitating for Russia, for their economy is in free fall. The military has underperformed. They have about 60 to 70% of their conventional forces are inside of Ukraine today. So right now they're in no position to invade anybody else, not to mention not even take all of Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that his designs don't remain the same, which is to reconstitute what he views as Russia's rightful place in the world, and that includes the territorial claims over places like Belarus and Ukraine. Maybe not as part of Russia, but certainly as vassal states.
It is obvious that he has a complete disregard for international law. Given some of the tweets you've sent out, you have no doubt or question about his mental state and his stability. He is rogue. There's now maximum economic pressure. There is political pressure. Is that enough? What is it going to take to stop him?
Well, I think it's a mistake to think that when we talk about it, we're talking about some guy who's crazy or he is insane or so forth. I mean, he's certainly psychopathic, but that doesn't mean he's not capable of making decisions that he believes are rational. I think his history has been to double down, right? Anytime he's gone into conflict or anytime he's had setbacks, rather than seek a new course, it's simply to dig in. And I think in this particular case, he has adjusted his strategy, his goals. They're no longer to overthrow the government in Kyiv and take over all of Ukraine. His goal now is to encircle 5 or 6 key cities, take and consolidate the hold on the coastal south and the Donbass, degrade Ukraine's military capabilities and their defense industries, and then with that advantage, with that as leverage, force Ukraine to accept a peace deal that includes permanent demilitarization, putting neutrality in their constitution, maybe even in putting some pro-Russian figures in the Ukrainian government, like in the position of prime minister or the like. I think his objective has changed in that regard, but the methodology by which he's pursuing it is even worse, because he's talking about laying siege to 6 cities, and that includes killing, starving whoever's in those cities.
I mentioned we don't know his end game. We do know he's frustrated. We do know he's humiliated, and will seemingly stop at nothing. What happens if a Russian missile lands in NATO territory? I mean, Lviv is not far from the Polish border. How do we react? And as President Zelensky has said, we are, in his mind, in the midst of World War III. Are we close?
I don't believe we're on the verge of World War III. As far as a missile landing inside of Poland or some other NATO country, my expectation obviously would be that that country would then invoke Article 5, or especially if they believed it was deliberate, and there would be a proportional response to it of some sort of fashion, perhaps targeting whatever the site of that missile launch was. But that could quickly escalate. Look, I'm not telling you Putin gets to dictate everything here. At the end of the day, there are certain lines that if he crosses, there will be consequences. There have to be. But we should not be the ones to cross them first, simply because the price for such a conflict is extraordinarily high. And our country has a lot of priorities around the world. Not that Ukraine and what's happening in Europe isn't, but there's a lot to balance here. Generally, I'm one of the guys out there that's calling for more forward-leaning action. But this particular case, I just think people need to understand how quickly this could devolve into something that's truly catastrophic for all of Europe, but for Ukraine in particular. But that said, we don't control everything here. Putin could make decisions or miscalculations or mistakes that do end up leading to a broader conflict, and that would be terrible for the world, but that would be on him.